Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out on this Thursday night. I'm Nick Neely, an assistant professor of English writing here at Eastern Oregon University. Welcome to the Sandra and Carl Ellston Ars Poetica Fund event featuring essayists Emily Maloney and Katherine Standefer in conversation with Melissa Matthewson. As people settle in, I'm just going to drop a few links into the chat. Few links and reminders. If I can pull it up here. First, this event tonight concludes our winter term Ars Poetica series, but we'll have a new one to announce for you shortly for the spring. So please stay tuned for that. The best way to see announcements about future Ars Poetica events and videos is via our visiting writers webpage. They're in the chat for you now. Also, you can check out past events, recordings of them on YouTube, our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, English Writing Program, and then our special Wilderness Ecology and Community Concentration, the WEC. I've also dropped in some links to the web pages for our featured authors tonight and their books. So please explore those at your leisure. As we begin, I'd like to offer a brief land acknowledgement, since many of us are here in La Grande, where EOU is sited. We humbly acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land Eastern Oregon University is upon, the Cayuse, Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Nez Perce people. We celebrate their traditions, languages, and stories. We acknowledge their continuing connection to the land, water, and community, and pay our respects to these original stewards of Northeastern Oregon. Additionally, I wanted to acknowledge the Ukrainian people as they bravely resist the Russian invasion ongoing. We're lucky to be able to talk about literature tonight from the safety of our homes, which is something this war and the Russian assault on freedom of speech reminds me not to take for granted. I'm glad we can all be here together. Thank you. All right, here's how it's going to go tonight. I'm going to briefly introduce Emily first, who will read, and then I'll introduce Katherine, who will read, both for about 10 minutes. Afterward, Melissa has about 20 or 25 minutes of questions for them, and then we'll turn to your questions, and we hope you'll have many. Please submit your questions to the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll look for them there. It's easier to find them there than in the chat often. With that, it's now my pleasure to introduce Emily Maloney. Emily is the author of Cost of Living, an essay collection, which was released just last month and just reviewed last week in the New York Times. You should check out that glowing review. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, Glamour, The Atlantic, the North American Review, Virginia Quarterly Review, the American Journal of Nursing, and the Best American Essays 2017. She has also worked as a dog groomer, pastry chef, general contractor, tile setter, catalog model, and has sold her ceramics at art fairs. She's a MacDowell Fellow, a 2019 Illinois Arts Council Fellow, and a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh MFA program. She lives in Evanston, Illinois. Here's how the publisher in part describes her new collection, Cost of Living. What does it cost to live? When we fall ill, our lives are itemized on a spreadsheet. $1,000 for a broken leg, a few hundred for a nasty cut while cooking dinner. Then there are the greater costs of even greater misfortunes, the car accidents, breast cancers, blood diseases, and dark depressions. When Emily Maloney was 19, she tried to kill herself, an act that would not only cost a great deal personally, but also financially, sending her down a dark spiral of misdiagnoses, years spent in and out of hospitals and doctors' offices, and tens of thousands owed in medical debt. To work to pay off this crippling burden, Emily becomes an emergency room technician, doing the grunt work in a hospital and taking care of patients at their most vulnerable moments, chronicling these interactions in searingly beautiful, surprising ways. It's a dynamic collection and we're excited to have her with us tonight. Emily, it's a pleasure to have you. Please take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to be reading from about the middle of the book. This essay is called Soft Restraints. So I'll just start from the beginning. The woman blew in on a Thursday, early into second shift. It was late spring. Things had begun to heat up outside and in the ER, a kind of June panic that meant admissions increased as the temperature rose. Spring fever, the nurses called it. I had been working in the ER for a few months by now, where patients flowed through the premises with some degree of repetition and regularity. These were patients who saw us as a kind of checkpoint between here and there, a middle ground. One of the hospitals in the area was great for having a baby. Another had a helipad and seemed to get all the trauma cases. We were the ones with the locked psychiatric ward. She seemed less a person and more a force. In her late 20s, light brown hair, blue eyes, medium build, and when I first saw her, thrashing up and out of the bed as if in seizure. By then, I had some experience dealing with patients, and she seemed no different at first, just louder and harder to understand. When you see someone on the worst day of their life, it is hard to know what to say or do, but you learn because there are so many of them, and they are all having the worst days of their lives. In a sense, most of the ER was about worst days. If they felt better, they would be at their own physician's office, or at home, or buying bags of frozen peas in the grocery store. This was a woman I could see buying frozen peas. I thought of her pink manicured hand dropping the bag into her cart. Maybe her name was Elizabeth. Elizabeth thrashed and cursed. "Don't touch me," she screamed at our charge nurse, Ellie, who was trying to start an IV. The ER was laid out in an oval with a ring of rooms on its perimeter and the nursing station and the doctor's desks inside. Katya, the other ER tech, and I stood at the edge of the ring, leaning up against the counter that separated the station from the hallway, directly across from room 14. Elizabeth kept kicking and screaming. She wasn't sorry. She didn't care what our charge nurse had to say. She would not submit to a talk screen, thank you very much. And she was disinterested in voluntarily participating in whatever we had on offer, which in this case involved restraints. So she kicked and screamed some more while Katya and I watched from the hallway. Katya was practical, even-tempered, career-minded. She was going to go to medical school eventually, once she retook the MCAT and scored well enough to get in. She had been a tech for years. Working as one created an important but temporary space between childhood and the rest of her life. She had lots of experience working with lots of patients and had also worked at hospitals much scarier than ours. "I don't want to go in there," Katya said, a little under her breath. I had reached this part of my life unexpectedly, hadn't anticipated ever becoming an adult, and yet somehow I was, legally, of age and expected to get along in the world. I had some vague idea of becoming a doctor too, but that was hard to explain to others at 22 when they found out I had half an English degree and none of the pre-med requirements completed except as audits or withdrawals on my transcripts. I had tried to enroll in chemistry or biology, but the work of those classes was far beyond the reach of my abilities. The classes were huge amphitheaters of teaching, and if you were late, there were not enough seats, and so you'd have to sit in the hall, which compounded my problem. I tried taking a class at the community college, but that moved too quickly and without the necessary pauses so I could understand what was being said. The labs were full of people who seemed to know intuitively what to do, how to pour the alcohols, to light the Bunsen burner without incident. A flick of the wrist here, some neatly copied equations there, in graph paper notebooks. I kept taking these classes even though I had no hope of passing. It was like this. I liked to pretend I could do it. And becoming an EMT still felt possible, made me feel closer to bodies, science. Being an EMT, or at least an ER tech, offered me a kind of legitimacy. In emergency situations, there are two types of restraints, hard and soft. Hard restraints are the stuff of television, the story of the patient sitting up and biting or striking a resident with an open mouth or a closed fist. It's the part of the show where the attending swears at a patient. They're locked with a key affixed with a magnet to the Pyxis at the nursing station. What people don't realize is that it's soft restraints, white, padded, and Velcroed, that are used most frequently, mostly for patients who are at risk of something happening to them. These are the patients who injure themselves by crawling out of bed or falling, or perhaps they have end-stage dementia, and they can't help but pull out their IV to spray blood around the room and spatter the privacy curtain drawn between patients. Patients who fiddle with bandages or who scratch where they shouldn't get soft restraints. For nearly everyone, we give them the benefit of the doubt. Usually we start with soft restraints and then move to hard should the situation warrant. There are rules. With Elizabeth, it seemed we would have to immediately up our game. There had been other patients before Elizabeth that day. I worked mostly on the fast track side of the emergency department, saw kids with kids, orthopedic injuries, new mothers who needed reassurance that the pediatric Tylenol was correctly dosed, men who had removed fingers in meat slicers, toddlers who had faced brick walls or concrete sidewalks and lost, split open a forehead or scalp and needed sutures or staples to put everything back together again. Early in our shift, a Muslim woman came in with a rash on her face that might have been lupus. It was never lupus, and yet there it was, butterfly stretched across her face, the top of each wing swooping to touch her hijab. Once we stopped laughing in the hallway at how strange it was, our gallows humor, like from an episode of House, someone went in and informed the patient, who was told to see her primary care physician immediately, and if she didn't have one, that we'd find her one. She insisted that I stay with her whenever our PA, who was male, examined her, and wasn't comfortable with a full exam in any case. So I was the one who took her temperature and blood pressure and touched her. I wanted to feel awful for laughing, but none of us did, not really. We laughed because people kept dying. And if you were not having a heart attack or a stroke, or maybe had a broken arm or needed sutures, we typically did not know what to do with you. The lupus was so easy, for once a relief, a diagnosis smacking us in the face. But by then, midway through the afternoon, the woman with lupus had been discharged, and so we waited for the next drama to slide through our doors. I occupied the world of the physically well then, or I thought I did. I had not yet been told that my thyroid had stopped working or that the lithium I was taking had likely hastened its demise. That would come a year later. There was no autoimmune asthma diagnosis then, no concerning liver results, no vomiting every time I got my period, no inflammation markers in my labs, no pain in the mornings that radiated from my joints and muscles and ran down my arms or legs. Elizabeth wasn't assigned to me, but I knew her from before, from prior worse days. She was what we called a frequent flyer, someone who was unable to make sense of the world she lived in, and so she came to us instead, a kind of tent revival in our suburban hospital for healing. She had been previously diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and fibromyalgia and had a history of drug dependence. And some sort of digestive ailment because everything was and is related to the gut, though few people treated patients with this in mind. Mark, the physician assigned to her, was not one of these types of practitioners. The fact that Elizabeth had fibromyalgia alone meant nobody in the ER was about to take her seriously. It was a made-up diagnosis for us then, a kind of early aughts placeholder for female hysteria. I too had a problem with being taken seriously. Not here exactly. Here I showed up for my shifts on time, learned the give and take of conversation, how to address patients, heard their stories, wrote down what drugs they took, performed EKGs and drew blood. And my job was time limited. The cost of doing business never lasted longer than a shift. But I was odd. I had difficulty understanding when I should speak and how far away to stand from someone else. When I interviewed for this job or any job, it was a kind of performance. I made great first impressions, but for those who got to know me, I might let my mask slip and could be intense in a way that some found off-putting. Here was another strangeness. I flapped my hands when excited or nervous or sometimes out of frustration, but mostly I did not know where to put myself. In a strange way, I believed I understood how Elizabeth's tragedy unfolded day after day. The night I showed up at Mercy Hospital, Iowa City, how I barely remembered the nurse who cared for me, the tech, how the pair forced my arm away from my mouth and administered 2 charcoal lavages. I remembered the second one. I was conscious then. For them, it was another shift, this life-saving work. And for me, it was the last day of something and the first day of something else. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Emily. That's an amazing glimpse into life in a hospital and searing material. Appreciate your reading. It's now, I'm grateful to be able to introduce Katherine Standefer. Her debut book is Lightning Flowers, My Journey to Uncover the Costs of Saving a Life. The book was a finalist for the Kirkus Prize in Nonfiction, as well as the Arizona, New Mexico Book Award in Memoir. It was selected as the New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice Staff Pick and featured on NPR. She has published work in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, High Country News, and Virginia Quarterly Review, as well as the Best American Essays, 2016, among many other journals. She was a Logan Nonfiction Fellow at the Carey Institute for Global Good in New York and at the Mesa Refuge in Point Reyes, California. She earned her MFA in Creative Nonfiction from the University of Arizona and teaches in Ashland University's Low Residency MFA program. Originally from outside Chicago, she now lives in New Mexico. Here's how the publisher in part describes Lightning Flowers. What if a life-saving medical device causes loss of life along its supply chain? That's the question Katherine Standefer finds herself asking one night after being suddenly shocked by her implanted cardiac defibrillator. In this gripping, intimate memoir about health, illness, and the invisible, reverberating effects of our medical system, Standefer recounts the astonishing true story of the rare diagnosis into a fraught maze of cardiology units, dramatic surgeries, and slow, painful recoveries. As her life increasingly comes to revolve around the defibrillator freshly wired into her heart, she becomes consumed with questions about the supply chain that allows such an ostensibly miraculous device to exist. So she sets out to trace its materials back to their roots. Thank you, Katherine. Appreciate you being with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be with everyone tonight. I'm going to be reading from chapter 10 of Lightning Flowers tonight. And what you need to know as I dive in is that the book opens with the night on which I took 2,000 volts to the heart. I have a genetic arrhythmia that can cause the heart to quiver instead of pumping blood. And this book is largely the story of my diagnosis and receiving a journey to receive an implanted cardiac defibrillator, which is considered to be a life-saving device, but which is actually much more complicated. And so in that opening scene, the device goes off erroneously 3 times in a row while I'm playing intramural soccer, 850 volts at a time. And I'm awake for it, which generally shouldn't happen. And it is part of how I suspected that I was being shocked by accident. So my book is achronological, and we come back to this moment in chapter 10. And so I'm going to write about, I'm going to read about some of the days after I took those shocks. In the days after the shocks, I slept in fits. I bent over my scorched heart. I stood before the mirror, staring at my flawless skin. There were no marks. If I'd been struck by lightning, my chest might have borne the thin branched burns where electricity followed water in the body. But this was an internal strike, a direct hit. No lightning flowers spread like pink trees across my breasts. Now the anger mounted. My arms were sore from the spasms brought on by electricity, my breasts raw down deep. It was a misfire, I kept saying aloud to those who were there that night and those who weren't. But in truth, it was not a misfire. The device had done exactly what it was programmed to do. Even though I had been told by Dr. Oza that I would not be shocked unless my heart rate reached 200 beats per minute for 6 beats or more, there had been some other box checked in my software. If any condition for action is met, rather than if all conditions are met. In theory, the ICD was advanced enough to know whether my heart's morphology was normal. It shouldn't have been confused by a heart rate pushed high by exercise, a totally normal heartbeat unfolding at 170 beats per minute. But if any, my heart rate had stayed above 170 for more than 3 minutes, the product of a slightly out of shape grad student careening around a soccer field in her long underwear and old cleats. And that apparently was also a condition specified inside the device's settings. As I watched the guy on the other team who had fallen get up, the battery generated 820 volts of electricity, the capacitor holding it back until it was fully amassed. Then it discharged into the center of my heart. In the weeks afterward, I stood in coffee shops expecting to be shocked. I rode my bike expecting to be shocked. I warned my first-year writing students of my condition in case something were to happen at the head of the room. Never mind that the settings had been fixed. I could feel the sensation saved up in my tissues, the burning that would come, the sickening thump, the scream. Now I understood there existed inside me a machine I could not control, subject to both human and mechanical errors. The part of me that never wanted the device had been reignited and burned steadily. After sepsis, I had recognized finally that having an ICD implanted did not exempt me from death. After the shocks, I saw for the first time that the ICD could as easily kill me as save me. The promise of being a cyborg was hollow. I researched how electricity moves through the body, how much it takes to cause permanent cellular damage, how much it takes to kill. I learned that 50 to 60% of patients take a shock within the first 9 to 11 months of implantation. I learned how lucky I had been. 10 to 20% of all internal cardiac defibrillator patients experience what doctors call electrical storms, 3 or more shocks within a 24-hour period triggered by the electrical instability of the heart, usually in their first 2 years with the device. I learned that in one such study, the mean number of shocks in such a storm was 17. But I also learned that multiple shocks in tight succession nearly always mean malfunction, since one shock should be adequate to disrupt an arrhythmia. Multiple shocks are the most frightening for patients, causing them to wonder if the device is really working or if the ICD will even kill them, writes Cynthia M. Doherty and her colleagues in the Journal of Cardiovascular Nursing. And indeed, any shock increases the chance of cardiac mortality by 2-fold. Pathological studies have demonstrated fibrosis and acute cellular injury in the hearts of patients who have had recent shocks. Even single shocks often cause significant psychological after effects, including heightened self-monitoring of bodily functions, uncertainty, increased dependence, reactive depression, helplessness, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Doherty notes that anxiety scores of those receiving ICD shocks have been reported to be similar to those with panic disorder. I would learn much later that ICD patients had committed suicide after being shocked. The medical professionals I'd turned to the morning after had treated my experience as though it were normal, had waved me off as one who carried no wounds. But it struck me that in any other period in history, to take electricity of this kind would mean nothing short of a spiritual transformation. It would signal a sign from the gods. This was lightning from a clear sky, a dark hand reaching down to touch the heart. I couldn't stop thinking about what my insides must look like. The shining twists of burned tissue, thickening flowers of the body cavity. The way that when lightning hits ground, sand fuses in long fingers that reach deep into the earth. I found myself toying with magnets, holding them in the palms of my hands. To place them over the slight rise in my skin would be the easiest way to quiet my cyborg parts, to take back control. But I knew this was a form of ceding control too, to allow the arrhythmia, its erratic logic and underlying threat, to inhabit my body unopposed, was to lean into death as an inevitable part of the human experience. It was the opposite of my long fight to have the device implanted. It was either spiritually bold or the worst kind of nihilism. Not long after the shocks, I received my bill for the first device check under my new graduate student insurance. In Colorado, the device checks had cost $30, the price of a specialist copay. The bill I received in Tucson was for $675. I understood that my new insurance had a fresh deductible, but I understood too, having worked the back end of a clinic, that this was likely a coding error, a matter of which umbrella the simple 10-minute visit fell under. I called and called. Over the years since I passed out in Jackson, I'd become forceful on these calls, spitting my words, growing loud. I knew that the people on the other end were humans, far removed from the decision makers, but I knew also that they held an inordinate amount of power over my financial life, and therefore my body, over the way I stalled or not on necessary healthcare visits. A device interrogation is not a procedure, I shouted at the phone when the billing agent told me how the visit had been coded. Jesus himself could not change this coding, the woman said. Never mind that Jesus himself did not, to my knowledge, ever present Lazarus with an itemized bill. I wanted it out of me. I dreamed of the magnets as a way of absolving myself of a requirement that I maintain it in any way, of the requirement that I prostrate myself to a system that so clearly did not care for me. I could die anyway. In the end, the bill was resubmitted, and 675 somehow became 275. And I put that 275 on a credit card just before it would have gone to collections, my graduate school stipend unaccommodating to such sudden bills. The $275 that I paid for the Pacer Clinic to download a few months' fruitless observations off my ICD could, I calculated, have bought me 18 appointments at the community acupuncture clinic that had proved essential to re-strengthening my parasympathetic nervous system. There, practitioners placed a gentle hand against my wrist to listen to my pulse, asked how I was, and listened carefully. They were people with whom I had built real relationships, reciprocal and empathetic, and who lay soft blankets over my body while I rested. Arguing down the cost of the bill had saved me $400 by one measure, but I could feel inside me the accumulation of these conversations, the quickening escalation, the full body nausea when the bills arrived in the mail. I was paying in other ways. I knew the precise difference between having insurance and not having insurance, of course, but most of the time that difference was invisible, seemingly meaningless. One of the central lies of modern healthcare, I realized then, was that it was doctors and facilities that bestowed good health upon us, that it was my visits and payments, my total compliance, that somehow added up to health. My life had been saved by IV antibiotics. My treatment plan during sepsis had been built by blood cultures and a battery of high-tech scans. I'd had pictures of my heart taken down my throat, which would have saved my life had the infection moved into my wires. I knew precisely the value of modern medicine. And yet I also knew that you could pump a person full of antibiotics and still lose her. There was some vitality that a body had or didn't have, allowing it to respond to treatments or not, a fire that burned or went out. That vitality did not come from doctors. Perhaps it could, but it was far from reliant on them, and it certainly could be weakened by them. Each time I sustained the injury of being assigned a treatment inappropriate for my stage of life, each time I was treated as irrational or invisible, my opinion irrelevant to my own care, each time I fought about a bill, it adversely affected my well-being. At the same time, there were things my body knew, essential to health, that were so often overlooked. I thought about the night I'd been sent home from the ER septic, terrified, begging them not to discharge me. And how that night on the soccer field, in the midst of taking 2,000 volts to the heart, some critical intelligence had told me, you can either scream or breathe. Without it, there would have been a fourth shock, then a fifth, maybe a sixth, before the effect of the exercise wore off, and my heart tipped below 170 beats per minute. I had more power over my health than I'd ever understood. And what I couldn't control would hardly be helped by my paying hundreds of dollars for visits that told me nothing. I quietly quit having my device checked. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. Yeah, a remarkable description of a double shock, the literal one, ultimately so scary, but also generative, and then the shock of being of the bill, among other things. Thank you. We now turn to the conversation portion of the evening, and we're going to switch to gallery mode so you can see everyone together. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Melissa Matthewson, who we are lucky to have teaching an MFA program in creative writing here at EOU. Melissa's first book is Tracing the Desire Line, which was a finalist for the 2021 Oregon Book Award. Her essays have been published in places including LitHub, Oregon Humanities, Longreads, Mid-American Review, The Rumpus, and many other journals. She has received residencies and scholarships to Playa, Tin House, and Breadloaf Environmental Writers Conference, among others. She holds a Master's in Science in Environmental Studies and Writing from the University of Montana and an MFA in Creative Nonfiction from the Vermont College of Fine Arts. She lives in Ashland, Oregon, where in addition to teaching for us, she also teaches in the communication department at Southern Oregon University. Thanks so much, Melissa. And I'm so excited to hear conversation between the three of you.
Yes, thank you, Nick. And thank you, Emily and Katherine, for those amazing readings. It's really a pleasure to talk to both of you tonight. Your books are incredible accomplishments, and the connections between them are really profound, having read both of them. And so I just wanted to commend you and appreciate your work first, and your commitment to investigating critical questions with such insight and intelligence, and a profound commitment to the truth. So thank you for that, and that's expressing my gratitude. Both of your books ask really important questions, both about the costs of living and the costs of saving a life. And you mix research and reporting and personal experience as a way to answer these questions. So I thought it would be a great starting point for our conversation, is if you could both talk about sort of the genesis of your books. So Emily, how did you begin the essay collection? Was the title Essay Cost of Living sort of the kernel to generate the material for the book? How did you map out the narrative threads? So that would be one question for you, Emily. And then for Katie and Katherine, what was your process for writing the memoir? How did you begin the book? Did you know that you wanted to write this book as you were experiencing these challenges in your body and illnesses? So those are my first questions. And I don't know who would like to begin.
I can, I guess. So cost of living, the essay came about because I was writing a piece. I was on assignment for VQR. I had pitched them something and they said, that sounds great, go report it. And then something terrible happened to my source, like just sort of didn't want to talk about it anymore. And so I emailed my editor, Paul Reyes, and I said, Paul, I'm really sorry. My story has gone out the window. But here's this random essay from my MFA thesis as a consolation prize. Could you possibly be interested in this instead? And it turned out he emailed me back and said, I think we can work with this. And then we had a call where we talked about it. The original title of this essay was The Cost of Suffering or something like, I do not title things, other people title things for me. That's not how I navigate the world. A lot of these essays were from my MFA thesis. Many of these pieces date to 2008, which is when I started writing them when I was an undergrad. So I really, I was enrolled in the graduate workshop at Iowa when I was an undergrad, and I took a workshop where this professor suggested that this was my shtick. She said, she called it The World According to Emily. Oh. And there were other, she was brutal and precise in the way that she identified people and their major malfunctions as writers. But she saw me, she understood who I was and what I was trying to do. And her first response to one of my scenes was, well, this is just, another anecdote from your storehouse. And I thought, well, that's true. I cried a lot in that class. I was also working at like a bakery from like 4 a.m. to noon every day. And then in the afternoons, I worked at the College of Public Health. So like I was working like 16 hours a day, and then in the evenings going to this class and writing. But that's kind of how it came together. It ended up being my MFA thesis at the University of Pittsburgh, which is where I ultimately got my MFA. And in terms of the actual sequencing of the pieces, Peter Trachtenberg, who was my thesis advisor at Pitt, said that I should think about it like a mixtape. And so that ended up becoming sort of how I thought about it. The essays for my MFA thesis, though, are not exactly what's in this book. There are pieces from my MFA thesis that turned into this book, but I also wrote some new pieces. And then my editor at Holt, who I love, was pretty instrumental in like helping me figure that out. It's funny, I had an idea of how I wanted the sequence to be, and then I sent it to some friends, and they said, no, it needs to be in this other order. And I said, okay, you're probably right. There are lots of good reasons for this. I sent it to my editor. He put it back in the same order that I had it in.
Whoa. Huh.
So I thought, we're onto something here. It's good to be seen, I think, and heard. But that's sort of the long and the short of how this book came about.
Okay, thank you. Katherine?
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I was a fiction writer and a poet at the moment I went into cardiac arrest in that parking lot at age 24. And I think I understood, because my entire life I had wanted to be a writer and known I would be a writer. I understood immediately that I was living a really big story. I didn't give too much of a synopsis at the beginning of my reading, but this book opens with that moment of passing out in a parking lot from cardiac arrest while uninsured. And so I have to figure out how to get heart surgery in the American healthcare system pre-Obamacare in 2009. And so I ended up having to leave my home in Jackson, Wyoming, and move to Boulder, Colorado, because a surgeon there said he would help me, and that state had better social services. So kind of from the first shot, this was going to be a story that I understood needed to be told. But it took me a little bit of time after the arc of that first round of health events settled to understand that I wouldn't be fictionalizing it. I tried. I was in this community level workshop at the University of Colorado, and everything was such thinly veiled memoir that at some point I was like, I think I just have to own this. I think I have to try to write this the way it actually happened. And what I've come to understand about it is that I didn't understand my own experience in illness well enough to create someone else's experience in it. I really had to excavate that on my own. And I have no doubt that there are more talented fiction writers than I who can sort of observe and report and research and find the right characters to carry different pieces of their story. But for me, I ultimately needed to be shaped by the process of writing this. I needed to sort of become through moving every bit of that story through my body. And so I was working, at the time I took that workshop, I was working at this little sexual health clinic in Boulder. I was terrible at supervising employees. I was terrible at auditing electronic health records, tracking data for the state. And so I just understood, I really love helping people own their stories of their body and being a part of talking about the healthcare system and removing barriers to care. But how can I do that from a frame that is actually more within my strengths? And it was like, well, obviously it's time to go get an MFA. So I went to the University of Arizona for nonfiction, not having written a lot of nonfiction. Props to them for letting me in. And I understood I was writing that story, but I really didn't understand what was included in it and not. And so this night that I took the 3 shocks to the heart was about 3 months into my first semester of the program. And I was actually taking a class at the time called Writing the Technological Sublime, which not sure there's a better example of the tech sublime than taking a bunch of electricity from an ostensibly life-saving device inside your body. And Chris Kokinos really helped me wrestle with like, how do I metabolize this moment in which a question really landed in my body, which was like, what is this thing inside me? You know, if it's life-saving, great, but if it is actually something that could harm me in addition to save me, I suddenly had this question of like where the materials might have come from and what my body contained that was so far beyond me. And so from that moment, it really assumed its current frame, that it was going to be about this wrestling with the device and whether or not it was life-saving, and in what ways was it and in what ways wasn't it. And I traveled in 2014. So in the second year of my program, I traveled to Madagascar and South Africa, did a big Kickstarter campaign where we raised $17,000 in 20 days and sort of added all of this reportage. And then as I was wrestling with that in the years after my program and trying to figure out how the pieces fit together and how I wanted to tell the story, that's when the later events in this book occurred. And I was on this plane to Colombia when the device vibrated inside me to let me know it had low battery, and I was going to have to make the decision on whether or not to get another one. And I just remember thinking like, God, is this the same book or is this a different book? Like, how do I want to cast this frame? Is what I wanted to talk about too specific to include whatever is about to come? And then I just kind of got swept downstream into those experiences, and they ended up really underlining this idea that there are costs to having medical technology in your body that maybe are less glamorous than what you're sold when you first receive an implant. And my experiences in the healthcare system now under the Affordable Care Act, insured by Obamacare, were equally as harrowing as being uninsured, just in very different ways. And policy had such concrete impacts on my health that then I kind of understood like, okay, all of this is in. But the structure of the book then really was up for grabs in a lot of ways. There was originally, this was a chronological narrative, and there was a big mining chunk of research from 2018 from a trip I took. And in the end, the book was too long. And I realized that if I cut that whole section, I was within the right word length. And then if I began braiding the narrative, maybe I could grow something that sort of accumulated into meaning with all of the microcraft decisions you might imagine to make that work. But it really, I always understood how to give the elevator pitch of the book, but what that actually turned into structurally took a really long time, kind of all the way till minute zero, when the publisher was like, we need to cancel your contract if you don't have this done. So.
Wow, that's an incredible insight into how you actually structured the book. That's a later question, so I'm going to hold that one. And you started, it was a good segue to my next question. You started to go there, and I'm hoping we can go a little bit more in depth. But in both of your books, Emily, your essays kind of chronicle your experience both as like a patient in the healthcare system, as well as working these various capacities. And what strikes me about the essays is the sharp insight into how the medical system fails us in so many ways, and you come at it in so many angles, from communication, oversight, bureaucracy, cost of care, etc. And Katherine, your book also highlights and exposes the problems of navigating a broken healthcare system. And so I'm wondering, and so the connections here, I love them, and I'm wondering if you can both, and Katherine, you kind of started to go there, if you can both address the challenges of writing about the healthcare system that you may be confronted, and how you think your books kind of situate within this larger conversation about how our health system doesn't often benefit the patient. And a little bit about how these experiences with writing about the healthcare system shaped your writing. So I don't know, I'd like to kind of take a shot at that first.
Katie, do you want to?
Yeah, I can.
We're starting to go there, so maybe.
Yeah.
It's such a good question, Melissa, because I read kind of every illness memoir I could get my hands on many or to most of which are cancer related in in terms of what actually gets published and what gets press. And then I also read a lot of the books about like the formation of the Affordable Care Act and healthcare in the US and healthcare in other countries. I had a real process of like building out the iceberg in my brain so that I could choose which tip to show, because my book is so global and so systemic. But I ultimately really was like, you know what? People have already written journalism about this healthcare system. I think it's my job just to show what my body went through. And like my body is a very particular body. It's an educated white body. And therefore, what my story really shows is the way kind of at every step along the path, if things go well, they only go well because some individual bent over backward to help me, which is like really lovely for me, but that's not a system. That's not a functioning system. And if I were a Black woman, you know, would I have received the same care, the same workaround? So I really wrote from this angle of like, it's interesting because when I was beginning to tell the story, I think I viewed myself much more as a victim of the system. And like, that's not untrue in its ways, but I'm also a really privileged, educated person who feels comfortable looking and applying for programs and doing something like executing a move to another state with better policies, right? Like there's this way in which my story, it's obnoxious that I have privilege other people don't have in the story. And it also is like, here's what the whole looks like at base, even if you have everything going for you, here's what the whole looks like. And then you can sort of fill in like, here's how much worse it is based on other factors. And so I really was like, you know what? I have been through this years long hazing ritual that really has shaped my life. My younger sister also goes into cardiac arrest at the beginning of the book. She starts going into cardiac arrest in her dorm room. She's 18 years old, but she's on my father's insurance because she's in college. And we talk often, and it's very clear in the book, how she only sustained the injury of having to face death at 18, which is like only that injury, and have a heart surgery and go through the physical implications of that and the restricted movement and the pain and fear. But she didn't have this whole layer of systemic and bureaucratic injury that I have absorbed. And in particular, in the part of the book where I'm trying to access an out-of-network provider because I've had a botched surgery, I just was so traumatized by the system that it has literally taken me years to put my life back together. And it's not because of the physical impacts on the heart. Like it has nothing to do with my heart condition. It's all about malfunction of technology and malfunctions of the system. And so I really had to wrestle with questions like, I'm not a doctor, and I have been made to feel like a crazy person by many physicians or admin staff that I've worked with over the years. How do I tell this story from a place of authority, from the authority I do actually have, as someone who unfortunately has had to learn the system inside out in order to get what I need? You know, like I'm the friend you call if you break your leg and you're wondering whether or not to pay the bills as they start coming in. So authority was a really big craft question for me, choosing to really dial back how much research into the healthcare system and focus instead on my specific technology and sort of the med tech engineering landscape. But it was really important to me not to gloss over the politics of it, because one of the greatest injuries that I was really suffering came after, obviously just the question of like, the Affordable Care Act did not exist before President Obama was elected. So like, that's a pretty big political moment. And that bill was in development as I was trying to figure out how to get heart surgery as an uninsured person. So the political rhetoric really like landed in my body in terms of whose life is worth saving and what the problem with people trying to get on social programs are, or how people should be able to access insurance. And then later in the book, as President Trump was elected, immediately I was like, I'm never going to have healthcare again. And I have a broken, stripped wire stuck in my chest. I'm not supposed to have to get this out emergently because it's not emergent, but I need to get it out emergently because I'm going to never have insurance again. And on the day it becomes a problem, I won't be able to access care. And I already know what that feels like. And so it became really important to me to try to strike the right balance of like, this is not a book that's just about railing on the Trump administration, even though maybe I'd love to write that book. But I really need to like layer in these key points that I was trying to make medical decisions based off my political predictions, and how traumatizing it was to be fighting to receive access to care at the same time that Congress is voting to repeal and voting to repeal and voting to repeal. And that all of that has to go into the way we think about a medical device and think about a system, because these systems are not operating outside all these other factors.
It's incredible, really. It's so complex, the layers and the way that you've crafted the book in order to take us through the narrative while also giving that whole picture is really just quite amazing. So Emily, what about you? Did you want to?
Yeah, no, there's a woman in my head and I write down whatever she says. And for a long time, I thought I had mental illness, but it turns out I'm just a writer. And that was sort of a lot of the impetus behind some of these scenes. I knew that I had seen people suffer for a long time. I was less sort of interested in the notion of my own suffering. I had written a little bit about it. I had a piece a few years ago that ended up in here about my relationship with my psychiatrist. But for the most part, I wanted to show how basically the American healthcare system has failed people on every single level. I mean, the ER where I worked, one of the ERs that I worked at, ultimately, we had 67 languages spoken by a hospital staff. And so we were in this really, really diverse group of people and patient population. We had patients who came in and who had a culture and no country. People who had suffered and undergone serious traumas over many years or many generations. We had, Holocaust survivors show up. We had people who, there was a woman once who showed up in our ER and she said, well, my older brother died in the war, and she meant World War I, like in like 1917 in like a trench in France. And I thought, wow, like some of these stories are just so important. And I didn't see them reflected in some of the other experience, like the other narratives that I was reading. A lot of the narratives of healthcare are written by physicians, occasionally nurses, but predominantly physicians, techs, patient care techs, ER techs, EMS. We see all sorts of shit that other people don't see. So, the kind of like dealing with bodies stuff that shows up. And basically I wrote this book as a book-length treatise in support of Medicare for all. I really want people to understand that just because they haven't had their own health ruined by some, or their own financial situation ruined by one terrible event. And I think increasingly with the pandemic, we're finding people who, were not vaccinated, chose not to be vaccinated, felt like it wasn't that big a deal or that important to them, ended up with a $7 million ECMO bill from the ICU, because that's the kind of world we live in now. So I do feel as though, there is a sort of silver lining to the pandemic in that, as people read this book or as people undergo and engage more with the healthcare system, they can see for themselves, it's been broken for a long time. In the hospitals where I worked, we were always running out of medium gloves. Like we did not have PPE in 2008. We're the photographs of everyone, wearing trash bags or reusing their masks and whatnot in the early days of the pandemic, people thought, well, like this is America, we shouldn't have to deal with those kinds of shortages here. But nurses and physicians and healthcare workers have been dealing with those shortages for a really long time. So that's basically why I put this book together, is I really feel it's important. I also had a background in bioethics. I almost completed my degree in bioethics at the same time at the University of Pittsburgh, when I was also an MFA student there. And so I really feel like there need to be ways to talk about these ideas, and ideally through narrative. And hopefully that's basically the goal of my book, is just a book length treatise in support of Medicare for all. So if I can get like one more person committed to it, then I've done my work. If I can just find one more reader,
Yeah.
So.
Well, I mean, the way that you incorporate all the stories and the narratives and the data is seamless, and the way that, and this kind of maybe, I know we're kind of running out of time, and I have like 10 more questions, which I'm probably not going to get to. So if anybody does have any questions, if you want to throw them in the Q&A, but I can keep asking mine until we wind down here. But Emily, the way you kind of embed yourself in these various settings to achieve this like really poignant perspective, and then you write these stories so intimately, like take us to these places. I'm curious, I have kind of a couple maybe connected questions for both of you about sort of the challenges of sort of writing in the research process, like the challenges of incorporating all of these narratives and the research and the politics. What were your challenges there? And then related to that, if you were recreating scenes from memory, can you talk a little bit about scene recreation in terms from a writerly perspective? And then also I want to throw in there, because we're winding down, like the persona that you've created in your books, the first person point of view, the I, if you want to talk a little bit about the role of that persona as well. So there's a kind of a 3-part question. I know that was a lot.
I think I can speak to those things relatively quickly, hopefully.
Great. Okay.
I noticed that Nick says, to mute too, if you're not speaking. I don't know, there's feedback or something. Anyway, basically, several things. In terms of creating the narrative there is a Frederick Reichen essay about first novels and why they fail. It was in an issue of Reader's Digest. If I PDF everything, I'm like obsessed with. I'm terrible. I mean, it's for educational purposes, to be fair. But if anyone wants a copy of this essay, just like email me afterwards or whatever, and I'll send it to you. But basically, he says that a lot of first novels fail because the narrator, author, and character all sort of mush together, and they become this one person on the page. And I feel like that's very true in nonfiction too. And so I wanted to be very careful. The character is that like idiot me, meat puppet me. I'm like wandering through the universe and making dumb mistakes and, doing dumb shit with patients or whatever. And when I say like, it's that part that says like, I didn't know then, but I know now, that's like the narrator speaking. And the narrator is like, older, wiser me. And it's sort of can parent me through the narrative. And that was something that was really important to me, to sort of create these separate people. And the author is, I'm making, choices in the room away from the book. I think that's really hard sometimes for people to understand. Lily Dansinger was talking about this online earlier today on Twitter about how, like people think that the memoir you or the personal essay you is you in real life, and then they make critiques about your lived experience and what they think the memoir should have been about, which is really fascinating. I don't know, I try to stay off of Goodreads, but there are these kinds of situations that come up again and again. I think that can be a real challenge, right? And I think the way to avoid that challenge, or to address that challenge in some way, is to have these sort of separate people whenever possible, this narrator author characters bit. Sorry, there were other parts to that question, but I can't remember what they are.
Okay, that was really fascinating to have that acknowledgement of how you crafted it. So thank you for that.
Sure.
Katherine, I don't know if you want to jump in related to that.
Yeah, that was such a great digestible tidbit. Thanks, Emily. You know, I feel like in relation, I'm sort of on the polar end, which is that paragraph after paragraph after paragraph of this book were taken literally out of my journals and essayistic newsletters. They Kickstarter updates to that crew of people. So I really am myself on the page. The main way that I crafted persona was just through exclusion, because other things were going on in my life that are not a part of the story as Lightning Flowers frames itself. So, you know, at one point I thought this book was going to include like, okay, if medical technology and corporatized healthcare doesn't serve me, what are all the ways I am healing? And like that was going to include sexuality, and it was going to include more about acupuncture and heart math and just like this whole hypnosis. Like I did a bunch of like research things. I went to psychic school for a class called How to Heal Yourself. And that is just not in this book. And I will have another book. I'm actually figuring out right now how to cover some of the same material and also move past it eloquently, because I'm writing about sex and love, and anyone who has read this book knows that there's a pretty important relationship character, but I don't need to rehash all of the events of this book again. So yeah, there's sort of an interesting multi-book narrator thing going on, but I do feel like my goal was to be as much myself. I want you, when you meet me in person, to really feel like you're with the same person who is in this book. The main narration questions I really had to solve had to do with the way I handle anger. So I was talking earlier about stepping into my authority around the right to critique healthcare systems and push back against doctors. And there are types of anger that I think just come across as ranting on the page that aren't actually like pointed in the way that carries the tone I wanted. But I absolutely didn't want to back off. I absolutely needed to say the things and sort of juice the insights out of my experiences and allow them to move in like really a sharp way. So that was a big sort of wrestle, like, am I there yet? And then I also had to make really big decisions. We didn't really talk yet about the mining strand of my book. And obviously, like, the biggest healthcare decision I made in terms of the way this book speaks to that system is actually choosing to include this whole global journey to understand how the piece of medical technology in my body is made. And like, you know, that led me to more research sites than are in the book. And again, with the iceberg and choosing which tip to show, the way I wrote those scenes initially was very different from the main narrative. I had sort of a reporter's voice, and then I had this memoir voice, and the two didn't really speak to each other except in my descriptions of land. Really, like, landscape description remained consistent. But I was not really that present in the mining chapters. And the reason was because once I figured out that I couldn't go chronologically in the structure, because for readers, that would mean like 6 chapters of illness and then suddenly 4 chapters of mining and then suddenly more illness. It's like someone who signs up to read an illness narrative isn't necessarily going to come along when I'm like, now let's go to some mines, and just like a lot of research at once and touring things, like that gets really belabored. So I had to move it out of chronological order and braid it. But there's a specific spot where chapter 4 touches chapter 5, that in one, at the end of the chapter, I'm a narrator who is about to have her first heart surgery. And in the next chapter, who I actually am, I've had a heart surgery, recovered from it, gone septic, almost died, broken up with my partner, taken shocks to the heart, and gone on this whole journey. And so I can't reflect on being at that mine as who I actually am on the page, because it ruins all that narrative tension for readers that's coming. And so I had to figure out, how do I get myself into that chapter without giving this away? And there's actually one key scene where my parents and I, when I'm like about to go to the airport to go to Madagascar to do this research, we go to the Apple store, and I was like trying to figure out whether or not to upgrade my device, and being around microelectronics sort of like blows my mind. And my parents are characters we've already met. And so that created this way of stitching the two together. And there also was a college version of me who had done research on fracking as an undergrad that I start reflecting on. And that gets me into the narrative with a version that's much closer to that 2009 narrator who's about to have heart surgery. It's basically 2006 to 2009 is the gap, as opposed to needing to bring in the actual current version of me that had all those other experiences I couldn't talk about. So the book basically has to like get readers all the way till chapter 11 before the person who's had all the experiences is at a mine in terms of the way the persona is crafted. So that was like a huge craft problem that I was trying to solve basically till the last minute. And it's why I got so tight on my time with my publisher.
I'm so glad that you addressed the structure of your book, because I was really struck by it. And I loved, for those that haven't read the book, the framing with Heidegger as well, and the way that you structured that. So thank you for going through there. And then also I had wanted to talk about going to Madagascar and the research process. We are running out of time, so I'm glad that you mentioned that as well. I want to ask one final question, and this is a question I often get a lot in my nonfiction from my students, and as I'm teaching nonfiction. But I was wondering if you could end by talking a little bit about like truth telling and being vulnerable on the page in the ways that you have been in your book, and how you approach taking those risks as a writer. Emily, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. I think with respect to truth telling, there's a lot I did not include in this book. I probably have, I don't know, enough for another book would be an alternate version of Cost of Living. I'm not working on that now. I'm working on the book that's under contract. But I think that there's a lot of, I was educated initially at the University of Iowa, and the University of Iowa historically is not super concerned with literal truth. The idea that you can write something and it can feel true, whether or not it is objectively true, is something that I think a number of people in the program tend to play with. I started in poetry and moved to nonfiction and fiction. I'm also working on a novel in my spare time. It's like my side piece. Like when I get bored working on Burn This House Down, I'm like, oh, like there's this other book that's like waiting in the wings. But I think it's really important to be honest. And I do feel that I did as much as I possibly could to make every single thing here as honest and as true as I could. I was subjected to a very rigorous fact-checking process for both of my pieces with VQR. I sent them my medical records, my medical debt. Like I had a very substantial legal review as well. I think it's really hard to satisfy everyone. And there are certainly stories that I didn't include or that didn't make the final cut. But I still feel like the book is something I can stand behind. And I think that's ultimately the most important thing, is like whether or not you can defend your work. And that's pretty much it for me.
Thanks. Katherine, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, vulnerability is such an important piece of this book. And I think such a natural piece because of the way writing these experiences required that I move all of them back through my body. I basically had to do trauma work on significant sections of this book. So I really have been through an extensive excavation to try to understand what things actually are and to have access to the whole experience. And you know, I'm just not that interested in leaving stuff out. Maybe that's part of thinking that I could die at any time after these experiences. I have a lot, I'm really sort of out of the ability to care in terms of some of that. And I really think that we would be living in better systems and a better society overall if we were wrestling with things as fully as possible and being honest in public. And so I always want my work to, through my own honest reckoning with my own body, connect people to their own bodies and to their actual experience and sort of invite them to recognize in themselves what it's useful to recognize. I think the one place that I had to make some pretty specific decisions was around my ex. And I actually spent 2 hours interviewing him at one point in the process because he was not very happy about the way I boiled some things down. And I really wanted to see, what do you remember about that time? Why did you date me? What do you remember about that summer? How do you tell the story of our breakup? What was going on for you at work? And it wasn't to disqualify my own observations, but really to recognize that I was going off. I mean, I have a very good memory and he does not. So it was sort of like, I beat you. He had like no documentation to bring me. I was sort of begging him, like, tell me times I was not great to you, like, help me balance my character. And he kind of couldn't, but he could remind me of like what a sad, scared bro he was. You know, we met rock climbing, we were in our 20s. He was very able-bodied. He didn't have a family history of serious illness, and he was just in way over his head. And it was the recession, and he was struggling with jobs. And so for me to like still own my experiences, but allow the reader to kind of see over my shoulder to how he was feeling and how he was doing, and to really let them wrestle with the archetypal version of that this isn't just me and my ex. It's, you know, I can't tell you how many folks I've gotten emails from who recognize their own relationship dynamics in illness and the sort of like impossible choices of when a caregiver gets burned out, or just like is young and doesn't have emotional capacity. So that was a place that I didn't want vulnerability to amount to like throwing this man under the bus, because he really showed up as long as he could, as well as he could. And it's a difficult experience, and I want the truth of that to come through too.
Thank you both for answering that question, and thank you for having this conversation. Like I said, your books are tremendous accomplishments and great contributions to literature. I'm going to hand it over to Nick.
And as a nonfiction writer, I've just been taking notes in the background here, and thinking, how do I write as honestly as these brave, inspiring women? So I just want to thank you, Emily, Katherine, and Melissa, for such great readings, questions, and conversation. Congratulations on all the success of your first books. And Emily, your book is just out, but I'd be remiss if I didn't congratulate you for your just announced second book deal for Burn This House Down, which I know we're all already really excited for. So keep it rolling. And I want to say thanks also to Sheldon and Devon, who are our tech gurus behind the scenes, making sure we don't run aground here, and we did not. And finally, thanks to everyone for attending tonight. I hope you enjoyed it, and hope you'll join us again next term for more readings and conversation, and stay tuned for news about that. I'll get it out shortly to you one way or the other. And appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Katherine.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone. Take care.